Welcome back to Adventures in DevOps. It certainly seems most of the tech industry is running around like headless chickens, and we're hoping to bring some sensibility to the current state by focusing on observability. For that, we brought in co-founder of Grafana Labs, Anthony Woods. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Warren. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting
We've been
me.
trying to get you on for months, and obviously it was one thing and then another. First GrafanaCon, and then the recent source code exfiltration attacks, which we will definitely get to.
Great. Yes, definitely happy to get into it. It's definitely busy. Obviously, the observability industry's got a lot of work cut out for it at the moment.
What is like the most top of mind thing regarding trying to help customers today? Obviously OTel is almost old at this point since 2019, but what is old is new again. So, but maybe there's something else particularly on your mind.
Yeah, I think it's just a lot of customers that we're working with are just going through revamping their observability strategies. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The two things that, their engineering leadership, is focused on is reducing costs, right? And improving productivity, right? Basically, that's the things that they care about most. What we've seen is observability is a big part of that. Observability, for a lot of our customers, is a very large line item on their bills. And so they want to work out ways where they can optimize those costs. So they're trying to balance both deliver more observability to their developing teams, at the same time do it cheaper. So it's a little bit of conflicting priorities there.
I think everyone's familiar with Coinbase reporting pre-pandemic, the $65 million spend on Datadog.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's not unusual. We do see a lot of customers that have very, very large bills. And the thing that we're hearing from those customers is that they just feel that there's just misalignment between the cost and the value. Back in the days when, interest rates were $0, right? And money was free. It didn't matter, right? You could just go and spend money. And all you really cared about was that velocity, that engineering velocity, go and get things done. But then when things changed and we started caring about money again, it matters now, right? People want to still have their observability, but they really want to align that cost and value and make sure that it's making sense from a business perspective.
How have you been able to overcome that sort of duality there, where it does seem like fundamentally, since if nothing goes wrong, it's a lot like security, that's the best you can hope for. And then when there is an issue, you are actually reporting on that effectively, so you can dive in and solve that. I think companies historically that have lots of problems are easy to justify a spend in observability, but the ones who need it the most tend to have fewer issues reported, right? The ones that have to have higher reliability. So especially the changeover since we've left the money is free era, how have you been able to sort of make that justification or the mindset shift for those customers to really understand what they're getting out of the stack?
What it really comes down to is, really focusing on developer productivity. Our engineers are very busy, right? We've had this, shift over the last decade or so, a little bit more right to this DevOps motion, right? Where more and more is being put on the developers to go, they have to be responsible for, right? Not only are they writing the code, they're testing it, they're deploying it, and they're operationally responsible for it. When you have them operationally responsible for things, you want them to feel comfortable that they're not going to be getting constantly paged at night, that things are working reliably. And if they're not, the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to slow down the velocity of deployment, right? Just to get back to how do we keep things sane and safe, right? But for some organizations, the risk is the, reliability, right? And the customer impact of unreliable systems. For other customers, the risk is the lack of velocity in development.
On the engineering side, how historically observability tools, monitoring, alerting, logs, traces, et cetera, are this sort of unfortunate situation that you get into only once you actually have an incident in production. How are you seeing that be a shift forward or earlier in a way so that people are involved in understanding how their stuff will be available when those incidents happen? Or when you talk about productivity, my thought is, are you seeing a fundamental shift in how development is being done or engineering is being done so that they have those tools earlier in the process?
I think it's still very similar to how it's always been, right? There's no, motivator like pain. Once you have your first incident, suddenly then you realize the importance of observability, right? There's nothing worse than, a system being offline and you finding about it because a customer has told you, or even worse, it's broken, but you don't know why and you don't have any data to understand what went wrong, right? The best you can do is turn it off and turn it back on again and hope things start working again, but you just don't have the data that you need. But what we're seeing happen now is just, with the tools that we have available, right? Certainly with the AI tools for being able to build code, it is so much easier for people to to create new features and new software. And so we are seeing that velocity is really accelerating. The level of expertise you need, right, to be able to ship software has dropped significantly. And then there's also questions about, what is the quality of that code that is being shipped, right? How reliable is it? And so certainly there's a need, right, to understand, how these systems are working and what's happening. But it's still a case of, sometimes you have to wait until, it comes back to bite you first before you realize, how important it is.
So if engineers are writing code faster, or if maybe we shouldn't call them engineers anymore, if code is being written faster by organizations, and there is something to be said about the average level of code potentially going down or getting closer to the mean in any organization, that means more bugs will show up. It seems right on cue that we really need to be talking about observability, honestly, here, because what we're saying is worse code potentially could be getting to production faster. I guess I'm waiting for that magical Grafana report to come out that reviews all the customers' logs and how many alerts they've got and whatnot, and actually can point to some real data about this, because there's lots of people standing up and saying, we're faster, but we're better. And from my own personal unfortunate experiences, it seems like, yeah, sure, faster. It seems like it's the opposite of better. There is an inverse relationship here. So what's the solution? Is there something that we should be looking at? Is there a different way that we should be thinking about it? Is it just a matter of having the right tools?
So there's a couple of interesting things, certainly we're going through now, in this new AI phase, is that one, it's been much easier to go and ship code, but now, there's a lot of questions around, are they actually valuable, right? Are they delivering value to the business, right? And this just comes down to classic observability, right? Do we understand what the system is doing? Do we understand how our users are interacting with it? Do we understand how much it costs to run this thing? And so all of these things are becoming more and more important, right? People have now realized it's not just about shipping features, right? It's understanding, like, are we shipping the right features? And are they doing what we want them to be doing? Are they having the desired impact on our business? If we've gone through the hype cycle of everyone just, well, let's just ship as many things as we can, to now where we're realizing, well, actually, let's focus on things that actually are delivering value, right? And success is not just about how many tokens am I burning.
Yeah, I think measuring the widgets is sort of the problem here. Like, what is the appropriate metric for use? I think historically, the knowledge industry has moved off of measuring lines of code, although it seems like we're back to that as the only reliable metric left. But I always like pointing to the original Dora metrics. It does feel like there's something that was always missing from them, and I think you really ran into it here, is that it's about the business impact realistically. And we've already seen a huge impact to GitHub, the product and organization, as a result of lots more code being generated. I don't think anyone's brought up so far, there's, maybe I'll say, even a competitive advantage of using an open source technology as your standard, or an open standard as your interface, because you have access to, or everyone now has access to, models which are repeating that information. And if you do something fundamentally different, then you're actually going to be at a competitive loss against the rest of the industry. Open tracing has been around for a while, but the OTel, I think it's 2019 or so. How did Grafana Labs sort of port what they had to that? Was it an easy transition because it was something you were always involved with, or was there a lot of stuff that had to change under the hood in order to make that an effective first-class integration?
Again, we're just kind of lucky with timing, where, certainly we started out, Grafana, really big focus on the infrastructure side with, Prometheus, actually, even Graphite before that, right? So actually, I'll tell a bit of a story here that's interesting, right? So like when we started Grafana back in 2014, right, the telemetry database at the time was Graphite, right? That was the dominant one, and that's what Grafana was originally written for. But from day one, we really wanted to focus on integration, right? And to be able to support other different time series databases and other different data stores in Grafana. And one of the nice things that we had is, part of the open source software, we'd have some anonymous phone home data that would come back from all these Grafana instances around the world, and we could see which data sources people were using. And so that really helped us kind of see this massive explosion of the use of Prometheus, right? Which is why we shifted back in 2017 to change and go and focus on the Prometheus ecosystem, right? Because we just saw this massive adoption of it, and a lot of that driven by the adoption of Kubernetes as well, right? Which was the Prometheus and kind of a Kubernetes paired really well together.
I feel like you almost sort of lucked out as well, because Prometheus initially is more of a pull-based system, which means it doesn't matter so much what the underlying protocol was going to be or the standard that was going to be used, because you controlled the whole mechanism on your side, rather than being a first-class API where people had to push data to. All it really required in a lot of areas is maybe flush out the push gateway or some other piece of technology as an intermediary between the technology stack or SDKs or third-party products and this sort of proxy gateway into allowing Prometheus to pull from it.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly can't take credit for that ourselves. I mean, we certainly have a large portion of the maintainers of the Prometheus project, but we certainly didn't create it. And a lot of it was inspired from, from the internal Google project Borg, right? Borgmon, right? So Kubernetes was the real implementation of Borg, and then Prometheus was the kind of re-implementation of Borgmon. Interestingly enough, OTel then came out of the new monitoring system inside Google, which is Monarch, right? And so there's a lot of competition between the two, right? And it still is, basically a religious war. What's better, push or versus pull for metric collection? I think both have value, right? In certain situations, there's no, perfect one, right? They're all good for the right use case, right? And I'm a big believer of pick the right tool for the job. But it's great to be able to see, we're seeing these kind of ecosystems kind of come together. We don't want everyone reinventing the wheel and building their own, observability architecture and solutions, right? We want to be able to take that decision away from
I think people. It's like a lot of things, microservice versus monolith is the canonical one. It doesn't matter which one you pick, you're going to find a way to mess it up in the long term anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
I do want to ask, though, if you do think that a particular architecture is going to see higher popularity in the years to come, potentially because of the pushes that AI stack are coming to, like not just what it's recommending, not if you just code something up and you ask an LLM, how should I do this? But realistically, what is actually needed by those stacks that are doing either data pipelines or model distillation or whatever have you there, inference at the end of the day. Is there something that is better fitted for that? Is there a particular strategy or tech stack or just ideology that comes with it? Or has everything related to AI, would you say it's very similar to what we've been doing all along?
I think it's similar, but there certainly are some differences. We definitely, certainly from an observability perspective, we feel as though this new agentic kind of phase that we're in is like a new software architecture phase. As big a change as moving from monoliths to microservices, from what we see, because it is a new way of writing software. It's a new group of people writing software in some cases, but also it has some new observability challenges.
One thing that I haven't been able to figure out fundamentally is whether or not the long-term trajectory, though, is accelerating or if it's still constant. And what I mean by that is we have seen a lot of technologies or ideas or paradigms pop up in the last 6 years or so, where they are very quick to be spun up and then very quickly get annihilated or removed because they aren't the optimal long-term solution. And I'm wondering if from those major milestones, one to another, if that is shrinking in time, or if you wait on understanding what the industry actually needs and then delivering something. If you say you just released AI observability, in 2026, is that late? I mean, from my standpoint, I'd say no. That's actually ahead of the curve. Like, you are riding the innovators wave here, because most organizations don't have even running their own models or inference in their own data centers, or even interacting with providers to do that. So I'm curious how you think about whether or not it's better to be supporting the innovators and early adopters here, or whether or not it'd be better to wait, see actual standards pop up that make sense, and then build products to support those.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's very challenging right now. I mean, I think there's certainly some foundations that we want to focus on. And that's where, we see things like OpenTelemetry being really important, right? Like, that's a foundation technology, right? Should be part of the architecture, because no matter what happens, no matter how the world around us changes, we still need to have visibility into what our software is doing. That's always going to be true. And who we means is certainly going to change, right? Historically that has been our SREs and our developers, but more and more that is now our agents, who still want to have visibility into what our software is doing, right? But they still need that telemetry data. So for us, I think, what we're understanding is that those foundations now are really important in getting it right.
I mean, if everyone believes there's a bubble and everyone believes it's going to pop, that you really have to question whether or not that is the collective wisdom that will follow. But there's a whole economic philosophy there that we're not going to go into. But the thing I will ask is whether or not you feel like the curve that was originally identified in Crossing the Chasm, that you start with these innovators and early adopters, early majority, late majority, and then laggards. Are you focused in a different part of the market from where you were before? Whereas maybe one could say, yeah, where totally early majority, late majority, that's the best place to look for, getting growth or customers or really just any sort of revenue. But if we think that it's changing, that maybe you're focused now in pushing to a different spot because you see that growth or the amplitude of the number of customers or the market segment there to be much bigger than it was before.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we definitely are playing in the early majority right now. Like, we saw that change certainly for our business a few years ago. And a lot of that is around open source, right? And we're like, hey, we've got this great open source technology stack. You can kind of mix and match and do what you want, and you can choose how you go and deploy our software and have all these flexibility and choice. And then we were discovering, the customers we were talking to were like, we don't want this choice thing, right? We want you to just tell us how to do observability and just do it properly. And so we're like, oh, okay. So we then took, our learnings, and we went and built, what is our Grafana Cloud platform today, right? Which is more opinionated, kind of out of the box experience, right? Where we focus less on building the technology and focus on building solutions, right? What's interesting is with those users, like, even though they're, the early majority, they're typically a little bit later to adopt technology. They're still adopting, this new AI agentic model just as fast as everybody else.
People want to get into it because they think they're going to miss out, and that just drives more and more the cycle of adoption. What I do want to ask you is, in the new product line changes, what you're delivering now, that you said the new features that have come out with the Barcelona conference this year, was there just a shift in what you're tracking, or also how you're exposing that data back for agents to consume it as well?
There's a big change in how the data is consumed, which is very interesting for us, right? As a company that's founded itself on being the dashboarding company, right? To discover the new world that we're moving into, it's like, how important is the dashboard anymore, right?
Right.
So many are developers where they're sitting in Claude Code or Codex or Copilot or whatever they're using, and from that they're just asking the questions, right? And they're saying, hey, what's happening in production right now? What is my system doing? And so we've had to kind of change, right? And make sure that, we're building a platform that can do both, right? One, we want to support this new model of agents being able to consume the telemetry data and look at it and understand it, and they can, make some good decisions around it. But at the same time, we still want to be able to, support dashboards, right? Because they are still useful, right? Like, especially when you want to have them up on a screen, you can see what's happening, or you want to generate a report that you can share with leadership, for example.
I guess there's a two-part question here, which is like, is the branding, should it still be Grafana Labs if the dashboards are for humans and you're transitioning to, a more agentic, interactive layer there? And, the second part is realistically this problem where, do we think that even the dashboards may be the better solution for models if they are multimodal in how they're consuming data? Is there something captured in the way the dashboard was created, or fundamentally do you need to change APIs to actually expose the data in a different way? Or is it, you've already had this data all along, it's already right there, it's just a matter of having the right MCP server set up, or having the user set up some configuration for access, and so it's an access control situation. It's not necessarily something fundamentally has to be different.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely changes that we're making to accommodate these new use cases. There's a couple of different things and a couple of different challenges, that we faced early on with AI. And one of it is that, I guess for most users, right, observability data is a lot of unstructured data. And we know LLMs don't really work well with unstructured data. It doesn't make a lot of sense to them. It doesn't make a lot of sense to individuals, right? When we look at it, right? You typically have context to kind of know what it means. And so one of the things that we've focused a lot on is, how do we build that context around it, right? The use of these open standards and open ecosystems around open telemetry really help, right? Because it's really well documented, data that we're collecting.
Are you doing something complex like setting up some sort of semantic layer for it to understand the data that you've actually collected, or are you using some sort of third-party product or something built into Grafana to actually utilize this?
Yeah, so we have this capability inside Grafana Cloud where, one, we're leveraging open telemetry, right? Where, it does have a very, well-structured semantic layer. And then it's a extensible system, right? So if you're using different data, outside of open telemetry, you can then go and define rules and build upon it. You can say, hey, these labels mean these things.
Are you training your own models to work through those business cases, or are you pulling an open weight model or another provider to actually help you through those internal challenges?
Yeah, I mean, so right now we're just using kind of the frontier models. What we discovered, that was really valuable for us is that the reason why the frontier models work so well with, our use cases and our technology is because of our open source, ecosystem, right? We've had this more than a decade of, building open source technology, but it's not just about the technology, it's the community and the ecosystem that we've built, right? There's so many people that blog about, how to use Grafana, or they write tutorials, or they've got public dashboards, or they've got, all this content that's just on the public internet about both what they're doing with our technology and how to actually use it to do that. So the models just know, right? We haven't had to go and train our own models to get to success. They just work out of the box, and that's a very big competitive advantage that we have.
Something very exciting about asking questions to the frontier models and getting back relevant context about your products or how to implement things from a technology standpoint. Or, for us recently, it was like actually understanding our business case and being able to explain it, fitting in the market segment, especially when you're doing something very nuanced. So, I mean, I don't think I've ever heard anyone stand up and say, yeah, I can't wait to, build our own models. I have a lot of extra cash I want to throw away and burn. And so this is going to give us a great opportunity. There is something to be said about small models that can run faster and are trained on a very specific data set. But when you are utilizing open standards or you have such a huge prevalence in the market, you may not ever need to actually do that.
I was going to say, especially with the how fast the models are evolving, right? Like it's very difficult to compete against Anthropic and OpenAI and Google, et cetera, right? Like they have a much bigger budget, right? and an infrastructure footprint to go and train models than anybody else.
Well, if anyone is actually concerned about that, I would say that realistically, a lot of different ways in which you can utilize a model are easily utilized via the non-frontier models by the private model providers. There's a lot of great open weight models where if you, and I hate to say this, if you're just prompting it right, you can get a good response without a problem. But I mean, I do understand what you're saying. If you're not doing anything, what I have found is that for a lot of use cases, the system prompts that the model providers, Gemini, Anthropic, OpenAI have do a huge disservice to the value that they're offering. So if you already are on the path of managing your own system prompt and how the agents are really focused on and the data that is exposed to them through MCP or tool calling, I think you can get really far today and probably a lot farther if you are just running your own smaller model off the stack. Something that I saw, and I want to get your perspective on this, is that recently, especially with the increase in open source slop, is that we've seen models and people utilizing models to create a lot of pull requests on open source libraries. And on the flip side, we've seen this mistake that some companies have made, most notably HashiCorp or LocalStack, transitioning their license models to some sort of business license. I really appreciate how Grafana has used the AGPL version 3, and I just don't understand why anyone would ever switch. And maybe after this call, you'll be like, "Uh-oh, we're going to be switching." I mean, you basically have said how important it is to contribute publicly open source, have people out there who are generating for their own benefit docs and guides on using Grafana, who you pay zero to basically and get all the benefit from. And you lose all of that by switching off. But what I do want to ask is, since the now huge amount of capability or quote unquote productivity that we see open source developers have in interacting or creating pull requests to open source projects, have you had to deal with any of the blowback from that on your side? Have there been any challenges to deal with potentially increased pull requests or spam or noise on issue tickets, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, the first thing I can say, yes, AGPL, right? We have no plans to move to a closed source licensing model. In fact, we're really excited. I mean, we've seen a number of big well-known open source companies and projects that move to a closed source license, typically SSPL, who are now coming back, right? Who are now adopting AGPL, right? Just because they've, and they're referencing us as a reason for that, which, we're very proud of. But, open source for us, it's important, right? Like it's a deliberate business decision, right? We see a lot of value in building healthy ecosystems, right? It's not just about, the code itself, right? It's about building vibrant ecosystems and a community of people that can kind of share knowledge and kind of come together. And that's what's really important to us. And that's working really well. And obviously, we were Apache licensed and then we moved to AGPL because, there is still that threat of, the hyperscalers, taking your open source technology and getting all the revenue from it, right? So, you do want to go and protect that. But we do feel like the AGPL model does give us the protections that we need. We are seeing, a lot of, pull requests coming through and it is problematic. And, I think we're having a similar approach where we're kind of just advising people just don't send it, right? One of the challenges is that for large, open source projects, large code bases, one thing that's really important to make sure one thing that's really important is to make sure the code is maintainable. And so there's a lot of work that we go and do to, enforce our own coding standards and our own way of doing things. And so, as we're making changes, we want to make sure that the changes that are getting introduced kind of match the rest of the code base, right? And are aligned with those standards that we've got internally. And a lot of the AI code that's generated, they're not generated based on our standards, right? They're generated based on whatever standards they've decided is common, for example. And so obviously there's a big work to go through that review cycle and have to go and change things, right? So that, even though the pull request may implement the change and it may be technically correct, right? Like we still want to make sure that the code's maintainable. That is a big challenge where, it's very difficult to accept pull requests that are just AI generated because they don't deliver a huge amount of value to the open source project.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any sort of technical implementation or technical solution that you've put in place or non-technical implementation to help combat this in any way?
And I know there's some conversations, certainly in the Open Telemetry project, right, where they've had some pain around this. And I think they've just had the approach of just like, saying, we're just not accepting, AI generated pull requests, right? For one, they just won't get reviewed, unless it looks like it's a person. And I think that's just the easier approach. What's interesting is, we see this challenge in the industry, right, for software development where, we don't need new grads anymore, right? AI agents can do the work that you would normally go and have a new grad do. And so then we run the problem of we don't need new grads. We only need experienced engineers. How do we in 10 years time have experienced engineers if no one's letting new grads today go and develop their skills
for sure.
to become experienced? So for me, I see that's where, there's a big opportunity in open source, right? Where, we still want those, hands-on people. We don't want AI to be used, right? Where they can go and write code. And it is a great ecosystem, right? Like you can go and write code, you can contribute it. And if you're a real person, the maintainers will support you, right? They'll coach you, they'll guide you on how to go and build, better software and improve things. So I see as open source as being the saving, grace for, how we're going to get, new grads to develop their own, their skills over time so that they can, be productive in the environment.
I think that's a very interesting perspective that open source loves artisanal software development, hand curated by humans. And it will set you apart as an experienced engineer to actually go and do that because maintainers want more human approach to it. I do think there is a little bit of the Silicon Valley's the show, Jin Yang's hot dog or not a hot dog problem, though. Like I see a lot of these repositories popping up saying we only accept non-AI generated code, but in practice, how do you know? Like if you know what code is being generated by an AI or an LLM, I feel like that is in its own impossible problem to solve that lots of people have been trying to work on for, I suppose, now only 4 years. So I actually wonder in practice, like what, like is this just a human going around be like, yep, that's LLM slop, close, 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 close. Or if there's an automatic system that someone's actually figured out to correctly identify LLM generated stuff.
I mean, I think it's challenging, right? As soon as you build a tool that can identify what looks like, AI content, the AI changes and works around it. That's always going to be the case. I think really what it comes to right now, it's certainly almost like a knee-jerk reaction, right? Like we're just getting overwhelmed with, a bunch of AI slop and noise. And so, we're taking an approach to kind of filter that out. I think, over time, I think we're going to be able to kind of focus on not saying just no, right, but articulating what it is that we want, right? Because there is probably a future where there is some AI generated code, where it's going to be valuable, right? So it's really about us, as projects, really understanding what is the key things that we want, right? The main thing, certainly for us that we understand is we want maintainable changes.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think that's a super mature perspective compared to like, we don't accept any of this because the realistic result is, well, we actually would accept it if it adhered to all of our, culture expectations and coding expectations. And I think just a lot of these repositories don't have that mentality of like, what sort of features are actually the right thing to build and what is the right way to do it. And then you may be actually motivated to add in some automation to codify your expectations on which features get in, how big should the features be, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think we are very quickly going to end up in a world where why would you reject LLM generated pull requests? That's not what you care about. You care about LLM generated pull requests that are useless and have a long-term detrimental effect to the longevity of the project, et cetera. One of the challenges with open source technology has always been, and I sort of hinted at this before, and I'm going to try to get you to say something on the record, is the security aspect. There's a lot of thought that what was open source had an inherent improved security mechanism because more people could look at that code. But I feel like over time, especially with the model usage increasing, everything is being looked at for vulnerabilities. And one of these things actually turned out to be a problem. I don't recall exactly what Grafana was using, but was susceptible, some of their open source repositories and closed source stuff, to Shai-Hulud, which is just this nasty worm out there that takes its name from Dune and basically just replicates itself by stealing NPM credentials, et cetera, and inserting itself. And I'm sort of curious, how did you actually, maybe how did you actually catch that this was happening? And the result was basically you're like, we don't need to pay any ransom for this.
What we're seeing is just like the supply chain attacks, right? Is the path that's being exploited right now. And the reality is everybody's using open source code. Even if it's a commercial proprietary system, the reality is they're still vendoring in a lot of open source dependencies, right? It's a common thing, right? Like, why do we want to go and reinvent the wheel? So it's a problem that's affecting everybody, right? Certainly not unique to open source users, and and certainly we were very transparent with the incident that affected us a couple of weeks ago. The summary of it for us is, yes, supply chain attack. They were able to get a credential from a developer and use that to access our GitHub repos. All they were able to get was our code bases, right? Which for us, majority of that is open source anyway, right? But because of the controls that we have in place, at no time were they able to access any of our production infrastructure or access our customer data. And so, that's great, right? We're really proud of the fact that we've got these controls in place that we're able to kind of protect our data. There's certainly more that we're doing now to protect things even further. But certainly, yes, when they came to us and said, hey, we're going to release all your code if you don't pay us, it was an easy choice for us to say, well, we're not going to pay you, one, because how do we guarantee you're not going to just release it anyway? But also, it's mostly open source code, right? That's not where our differentiation lies, right? Much to the displeasure of our sales team, most of the technology that we're building these days goes into our open source.
Or your lawyers.
And so, that was an easy choice for us to do, but certainly it was a lot of work. It was very impactful for the business to be able to, have to go through and audit everything, every single change on every single repository. What, has there been any compromises?
I love the perspective and the article that was released, honestly, because it was quick and timely, realistically, and a very methodical approach to what was actually reasonable done, rather than hiding behind secrecy for months on end and saying, well, something did happen because someone else reported it from a security agency or a security tester. And I always just think it's interesting what happens, and I'm not sure what the future will be here, especially because a lot of different package managers are attempting to take different precautions in place. And I'm hoping still that I can get someone on the record who knows a lot about package manager security on the show. I'm just waiting for the right person. So if you think that's you, please come and ping me, and we'll get you on. What I do want to still quickly jump into is, you did mention the challenge with some of the other hyperscalers basically utilizing the solution. And we have seen in the last few years or so, Grafana actually partnering directly with them to offer a managed version at a cost reasonably. And I'm wondering whether or not, given the current world views, whether or not there'll also be similar partnerships we should expect to pop up for other similar cloud providers, especially ones in Europe.
We want it to be, everywhere and available for everyone so that they're familiar with it. One, because it's great technology, and why wouldn't you want to use it? But also from a business, it's great for us to, for people to be familiar with our technology and our tool set, right?
For sure.
And so, we certainly did the partnerships. Amazon was the first one where, we licensed our technology so they could deliver the Amazon managed Grafana. We obviously did a similar partnership with Microsoft, in the Azure platform as well, Azure managed Grafana. we're always looking at other partners. What we're finding interesting is that, certainly for a lot of our users, Grafana Cloud is going to be their preferred method, just because that's where there's much richer capabilities, right? And it is a more kind of out of the box experience and kind of solves all the observability problems. And we certainly, have built a solution that supports all the different cloud providers, right? So it doesn't matter who you're running it will be, it'll work for you. And we see many customers that are multi-cloud, right? That are in different providers and are using different systems. And so they need, an observability product that can work across all of those, right? And be able to correlate across, all the different providers. So,
yeah, it's hard to do it any other way. I mean, otherwise you build it and no users come, or you waste a lot of money on something that doesn't make a lot of sense, for sure. I think at this point it probably would be a good opportunity to switch over to picks for the episode. So Anthony, what did you bring for the audience today?
Yeah. So that's great. Also, obviously for me, it was a bit of a challenge, like what am I interested in? The reality is Grafana Labs. That's my passion. But we've already spoken enough about that. But one thing that I thought was really timely was an essay that was brought to my attention. So Raj, our CEO, actually brought it up last week when we were talking, which is it's called The Bitter Lesson, right? So it was put together by Rich Sutton, right, AI researcher out of Google, and it's really a very an interesting read, timely read. It was written a long time ago, back in 2019, but it's really a kind of a focus around, the looking back at the, evolution of AI over the last, 70 years, right? For as long as we've been doing this, and kind of understanding where, what we're seeing play out, right? Where the reality is that, trying to build more kind of domain specific, tools, they'll always get beaten by generic tools where you are just throwing larger and larger volumes of data at larger and larger volumes of compute, right? So we've seen this with the rise of LLMs, right? For years, everyone was trying to build, domain specific kind of AI tools, whether it was in, whatever, say, the medical field, right? Right. But now we're seeing that the large language models, right, where you just throw all of the data at it, right, and you just process it with more and more compute power, you end up getting better results, than these unique tools, right? The good examples that it brings up is around, like even chess, right? Like where, started off, they were, encoding chess strategies, right, into, these AI tools to make it think like a person. But then the way they made the most successful ones is where they just said, actually, let's just build a big neural network and just have you play chess against each other as many times as possible. And you'll just, with the volumes of data, you'll end up being better. And that's the world that we're living in now. There's companies, right, that have just disappeared overnight because they built these, domain specific AI technologies. And now, these generative AI tools have just come out and just completely just, overrun them. And it's always going to be the case where, right now we talked about it earlier today, right, where, sometimes building those more domain specific kind of things works for some things, right, for a while, right? But then what's happening is then the larger models are then getting better at it, inevitably over time anyway. And so, we're always having to constantly kind of iterate. And so I think it was a really good, kind of read to go through that and kind of reflect on that. Right?
The original DeepMind approach that solved chess, I guess, realistically wasn't trained just on chess. It was completely unsupervised training there. I do think there's an interesting perspective here, which is that realistically, the reason that companies are getting overtaken by the, I hate to call it Gen AI solutions instead, is because they didn't build or innovate on their space of having an LLM model that solves that problem. They just added an LLM to their space. And so they basically doubled down on having the best LLM, but for that area, and they weren't doing anything to get around it. And I think there's a question of like, where is the end of innovation for LLM design? And a lot of people are saying, oh yeah, it happened in Opus 4.6 or whatever. And as long as you can beat that on a benchmark in your particular area, maybe we'll come back to this particular space. But unless you're going to innovate and buy the cutting line GPUs to do the model training or be able to fine tune existing models out there, I do think a lot of those companies are going to fail just because it's not necessarily that the models are better. It's just like you don't have the technology to train to the level of capacity or reasoning that the companies that are dedicated to the actual hardware to work on. So I hope long term, we see an opportunity here where smaller models exist because it will be cheaper to maintain them and maybe increase the accuracy. But I think we have to get much closer to wherever the end of innovation for the LLM creation to actually apply.
I agree.
So what did I bring? I had to rack my brain over this. Since I started running engineering teams, I kept getting into popular culture. How good is this leader on screen? So think of your favorite character and your favorite television show or movie and see how they actually perform leadership qualities in the gambit. And I can't look away now. Like every single time I see a group of people on the screen, I'm questioning like, who is the leader? How are they working? Is this even a good leader? And you go back and you'll watch some old stuff and you're like, wow, this is not a team. This is just four random individuals with no organizational structure whatsoever. And the person who's called leader is just doing the worst job ever. I'm sorry if I broke anyone with this realization. And so over time, I'm just like, well, where is the best leader? The character that seems like it's the best emulation of a leader. And it makes sense because I think leaders aren't consulted on the set. Like you get medical doctors or military personnel or engineers when they want to design something or a process. But how often do you see like reference consultant for leadership on the set of some show before they're like, would a leader even say this? And so my pick is going to be the best leader that I've ever seen on the show, which is Captain Pike of Star Trek. And it's not the best Star Trek show, but it's definitely my favorite leader.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, right? But if you want to be a manager, right, it's a very different skill, right? It's a very different, problem set, but it's a very, very, very different role, very different set of problems.
I think just the single point of failure for someone doing everything in the highest leadership spot in an organization is just so problematic. But anyway, so this has ruined so many television shows for me that, I'm watching it and I'm just like, this is so unrealistic. This doesn't represent reality in any way. I guess my other theory,
or perhaps it does, right? It's just they could be a terrible leader. And
don't say that.
There's plenty of those that exist, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. I don't remember what it was, and I probably should find a reference to this. A long time ago, I read this thing like, if aliens came to Earth, what would be the thing about humans that would be most surprising or shocking for them? And for me, it just goes along this angle. I think it's the great attention spent in the last 100 years on how to manage humans effectively. That's a whole different philosophical topic. So in this episode, we actually reference a lot about productivity, and we have a separate episode dedicated to productivity. So if anyone is actually interested in that, that will be linked in the description, along with anything else that we've talked about. And there was quite a few number of things. So thank you, Anthony, for joining us today. It's been honestly a great episode.
No worries. Thanks, Warren. I've really enjoyed it.
And here's a short reminder to everyone who's listening to click subscribe to the Adventures in DevOps or leave a comment in the episode. You have no idea what that means to me. If you want me to make the right content and get the right guests on, make a suggestion or, say what you like or don't like. And I hope to see everyone again back next